I was the mistress, and I returned from the trip with him, carrying the stale perfume of hotels and lies in my hair, convinced that the world we had borrowed from secrecy would somehow survive exposure. Only to discover that while we were pretending the future could be postponed, his wife had sold the house as if she were auctioning off an entire marriage with the calm efficiency of someone who already knew the ending, leaving me to stand in the wreckage of my own illusions, realizing too late. That betrayal is never just an act committed in shadows, but a currency that circulates until everyone pays, and that I, who thought myself daring and chosen, had merely been another line item in a transaction I never controlled. I learned to see myself not as the other woman, but as the inevitable one, the woman who arrived not by accident, but by emotional precision, as if every step he took away from his marriage had been unconsciously rehearsed for my entrance. And I told myself this story so often that it hardened into truth. I framed our beginning as destiny rather than transgression, persuading myself that love which required secrecy was simply more refined, more selective, more honest than the love that survived on routine and shared bills. In my version of events, I was not stealing anything because what he gave me had already been withdrawn elsewhere, and I accepted his attention as proof of insight rather than evidence of fracture. I convinced myself that being chosen in private was more meaningful than being displayed in public, because intimacy, I believed then, thrived best when protected from the noise of legitimacy. Even the guilt I occasionally felt was repurposed into a sign of depth, as though only a serious woman could feel so conflicted while remaining so committed. This was how I began to mistake longing for confirmation and desire for entitlement, without noticing how carefully I was erasing the parts of the story that made me uncomfortable. Over time, the language I used internally shifted in subtle but decisive ways, because I stopped calling myself the mistress and started thinking of myself as the woman who understood him, the woman who listened without demands and loved without expectations. Which sounded noble until I realized how conveniently it excused his absence from accountability. I told myself that what we shared was rare precisely because it could not survive daylight, and I wore that belief like a private medal, invisible but heavy with self-importance. Whenever doubt surfaced, I silenced it by reminding myself that he came to me not out of obligation but out of desire, and that difference felt revolutionary enough to eclipse every moral hesitation. I compared my emotional fluency to what I imagined was her domestic fatigue, even though I had never seen her face or heard her voice, because comparison was the easiest way to stabilize my chosen identity. In doing so, I elevated myself without ever questioning the fragile foundation on which that elevation depended. I mistook my proximity to his truth for ownership of it, and that mistake would later prove costly. The more I believed I was chosen, the more I reinterpreted every sign of limitation as evidence of sacrifice, because scarcity can feel like devotion when you are desperate to feel exceptional. I told myself that his divided life was not a sign of cowardice, but of transition, and that I was witnessing him mid-transformation rather than mid-deception. Each canceled plan was reframed as a necessary delay, each unanswered call as proof of the pressure he endured to maintain appearances, and I admired his endurance without recognizing how little of it was spent on me. I allowed myself to feel superior not because I had more of him, but because I believed I had the best of him, which was an illusion carefully maintained by selective access. Even my loneliness became a badge of honor, because I believed suffering was the admission price for a future that would eventually validate everything. In this way, I collaborated willingly in my own marginalization, calling it patience so I would not have to call it fear. There was a quiet arrogance in the way I assumed clarity where there was none, because I believed that insight alone could compensate for lack of position, and that emotional intimacy was a form of power immune to legal or social structures. I convinced myself that being unseen did not make me insignificant, but rather elevated me above the banal need for recognition, as if anonymity were a philosophical choice rather than a condition imposed on me. Whenever I imagined the life he returned to, I softened its edges in my mind, picturing it as hollow and procedural so that my role could remain emotionally indispensable. I did not question why someone supposedly trapped in such emptiness never seemed to leave it, because questioning would have required me to confront the possibility that my importance was carefully circumscribed. Instead, I leaned deeper into the fantasy of inevitability, telling myself that love always finds its rightful place even if it takes time to rearrange the furniture of a life. I believed that being chosen emotionally was the first and most decisive victory, unaware that it was also the easiest promise to give and the hardest to prove. Looking back, I see how easily I adopted a narrative that flattered my vulnerability because it allowed me to feel powerful while remaining profoundly dependent on his perception of me. I wanted so badly to believe that I was not an accessory to his life, but its hidden center, the axis around which his dissatisfaction quietly revolved. This belief insulated me from shame while quietly cultivating it, because the higher I placed myself in the story, the further I fell from reality. I ignored the fact that being chosen without being claimed is not elevation but suspension, a state that feels temporary until it becomes permanent. At the time, I called it faith, because faith sounds intentional and brave, whereas waiting sounds passive and small. It was only much later that I understood how easily desire can masquerade as destiny when you are willing to confuse intensity with truth. I remember the first time I caught the lie not because it was elaborate or dramatic, but because it was effortless, delivered with such calm fluency that it barely registered as false until much later, when its details failed to survive memory. He spoke as if truth were optional, something flexible that could be reshaped depending on the listener, and instead of recoiling, I felt an unexpected pull toward that adaptability. There was something intoxicating in the way he could rewrite reality without breaking eye contact, as if sincerity were a performance rather than a principle. I told myself that this talent was a form of intelligence, a survival skill refined by years of emotional negotiation, and that recognizing it made me perceptive rather than complicit. His lie did not alarm me because it did not threaten me, and in that moment I confused safety with intimacy. I mistook the absence of consequence for trust, without realizing that lies only feel harmless when they are not yet aimed at you. As I replayed that moment in my mind, I noticed how quickly I adapted my expectations to accommodate his version of events, because alignment felt easier than resistance and agreement felt like connection. I watched how he adjusted his tone depending on the reaction he anticipated, softening when sympathy was required and sharpening when confidence was expected, and I admired the precision of it all. Instead of questioning what this meant for his integrity, I framed it as emotional intelligence, as if bending the truth were proof of emotional fluency rather than avoidance. I felt chosen because I was allowed behind the scenes, granted access to explanations that others supposedly did not deserve. That access made me feel special, as though knowing he lied placed me closer to his authentic self rather than further from it. I did not yet understand that proximity to manipulation does not equal immunity from it. What truly seduced me was not the lie itself, but the way he acknowledged it without naming it, offering just enough self-awareness to suggest honesty while withholding enough clarity to preserve ambiguity. He would smile slightly, as if inviting me to notice the inconsistency without forcing me to confront it, and that unspoken agreement created a quiet complicity between us. I felt intelligent for catching what others might miss, as though discernment were the same as control, and I let that feeling override my discomfort. His lies became signals rather than warnings, cues that I interpreted as intimacy codes meant only for me. I believed that seeing through him meant I could not be deceived, which is perhaps the most elegant lie of all. In reality, I was learning how to accept instability as charm. Over time, his dishonesty stopped feeling like a breach and started feeling like a language we shared, one that allowed us to bypass inconvenient truths without the mess of confrontation. I stopped asking questions whose answers might complicate things, because ambiguity preserved momentum, and momentum felt like love. The more I accepted his revisions of reality, the more I revised my own standards to match them, telling myself that rigidity was for people who feared complexity. I admired his ability to compartmentalize, unaware that I was volunteering to become one of those compartments. Each lie he told smoothly reinforced the idea that truth was less important than coherence, and coherence was something we could build together. By the time I noticed how often honesty was sacrificed for comfort, I was already invested in the comfort. Looking back, I can see how easily I mistook his ease with deception for confidence, and how that confidence filled spaces in me that uncertainty had left exposed. I was drawn to the way he seemed unburdened by contradiction, free from the hesitation that plagued my own decisions, and I wanted some of that freedom for myself. His lies promised flexibility in a world that often felt rigid and punishing, and I welcomed that promise without reading the fine print. I told myself that everyone lies and that what mattered was intention, conveniently ignoring that intention is impossible to verify when truth is negotiable. In allowing his dishonesty to feel seductive, I quietly consented to a relationship built on shifting ground. I did not yet realize that when someone lies as easily as they breathe, the air eventually becomes uninhabitable. Secrecy became the architecture of what we shared, not a flaw in its design, but its most carefully reinforced feature, because everything meaningful between us existed precisely because it could not be acknowledged. The absence of explicit promises created a strange freedom, allowing us to float above definitions while still demanding loyalty through implication. I told myself that what bound us was deeper than words, that needing to articulate commitment would only cheapen something so intuitively understood. Our silence functioned as a contract, one that felt more binding because it was never negotiated aloud. In the quiet spaces between messages and meetings, I felt an intensity that I had never associated with certainty, mistaking tension for depth. I believed that what survives without declaration must be stronger than anything that requires confirmation. The secrecy sharpened every interaction because nothing could be taken for granted and every moment carried the risk of disappearance. That risk made each exchange feel urgent, as though we were constantly racing against exposure, time, and reality itself. I felt closer to him because we were collaborators in concealment, partners in maintaining a fragile illusion that required constant attention. The world outside our arrangement became a threat rather than a reference point, which conveniently discouraged perspective. I told myself that this isolation was proof of how unique our bond was, because only something truly significant would require such protection. In truth, secrecy did not protect what we had so much as prevent it from being tested. Without promises, I learned to read meaning into gestures, delays, and half-finished sentences, constructing an emotional narrative from fragments because fragments were all I was given. Each stolen hour felt weighted with implication, as though its very scarcity guaranteed its value. I convinced myself that what he could not say publicly, he said through effort, and that effort became my metric for devotion. The lack of definition allowed me to imagine endless possibility while absolving him of responsibility, a balance that felt sustainable only because I refused to examine it closely. Secrecy made me feel chosen because it suggested selectivity, even though selectivity can exist without sincerity. I confused exclusivity with intimacy, unaware that one can exist entirely without the other. There was a peculiar comfort in knowing that no one else could see us, because invisibility spared us from comparison and judgment, at least on the surface. I did not have to measure our relationship against social norms or future plans, because secrecy suspended us outside time. That suspension felt romantic, like living in a perpetual present where consequences were theoretical rather than imminent. I told myself that labels were for people who lacked imagination, and that what we had transcended structure. In doing so, I allowed ambiguity to masquerade as sophistication. I did not notice how secrecy slowly replaced accountability as the glue holding us together. Only much later did I understand that secrecy binds tightly precisely because it limits options, making departure feel like betrayal rather than choice. By sharing a hidden world, we created a dependency that felt mutual but was unevenly distributed because he always had somewhere else to return to. I mistook my willingness to disappear for devotion, believing that sacrifice itself generated meaning. The silence that once felt intimate eventually began to feel imposed, but by then I had internalized it as proof of loyalty. Secrecy taught me how to endure without asking, how to wait without demanding, and how to call that patience love. It took time to see that what bound us was not a promise fulfilled, but a promise indefinitely postponed. The trip felt like a deliberate erasure of context, a temporary suspension of the life he returned to when geography no longer protected us, and within that suspension I allowed myself to believe that reality could be negotiated by distance. Airports and hotels became liminal spaces where history loosened its grip, and I told myself that if no one knew us there, then we were finally authentic. I watched how easily he settled into this version of himself, attentive and unencumbered, as though the absence of routine freed him to inhabit a truer role. I interpreted his ease as confirmation that this was where he belonged, with me, rather than as evidence of how well he adapted to whatever environment required the least accountability. In that neutral territory, I stopped asking questions whose answers might tether us back to consequence. I let the unfamiliar streets and borrowed rooms convince me that permanence was possible if we simply stayed moving. Every shared morning felt like a rehearsal for a life I pretended we were building, because repetition can mimic stability when you want it badly enough. I paid attention to the details that supported my illusion, the way he reached for me without hesitation and spoke about the future in vague but comforting terms. I ignored the specificity that was always missing, because specificity would have forced me to confront the limits of what he was offering. In those moments, I did not feel like an addition to his life, but like its center, because the rest of it had been temporarily edited out. I told myself that this was who he really was when freed from obligation, and that everything else was merely performance. I did not consider that freedom without responsibility often reveals desire, not character. The unfamiliarity of the place allowed me to shed the parts of myself that doubted, because doubt requires reference points, and I had willingly abandoned them. I dressed and moved as though I were finally visible, savoring the fantasy that no one would ever reduce me to an afterthought. I felt legitimate because there was no one present to contradict that feeling, and I mistook absence of opposition for validation. The trip offered me a version of myself unburdened by waiting, and I clung to that version with a desperation I refused to name. I believed that if I could feel this real here, then reality itself was simply a matter of relocation. I did not yet understand that borrowed spaces can only host borrowed truths. As the days passed, the rhythm of travel replaced the rhythm of secrecy, and I allowed myself to believe that transition itself was transformation. I noticed how carefully he avoided references to what awaited us at home, and I appreciated that avoidance as sensitivity rather than evasion. We spoke in hypotheticals that felt generous, but committed to nothing, and I filled the gaps with hope rather than caution. Each night reinforced the idea that we were building something uninterrupted, even though interruption was merely postponed. I told myself that love does not need witnesses to be real, conveniently forgetting that it does need continuity. In that suspended world, I let myself exist without footnotes. When the trip ended, I carried its logic with me like contraband, determined to preserve its rules even when they no longer applied. I wanted to believe that what we were there could be exported intact, ignoring how carefully it depended on being nowhere in particular. The neutrality that once felt liberating began to feel fragile, because it could not survive exposure to ordinary life. I realized too late that the wife did not exist on the trip because truth itself had been temporarily exiled. What I mistook for a neutral territory was actually a vacuum, and vacuums cannot sustain anything once the air returns. The trip gave me certainty without durability, and I loved it precisely because it asked nothing of me except belief. There was an undeniable thrill in maintaining a life that ran alongside my own, invisible yet consuming, because secrecy sharpens sensation and turns restraint into seduction. Hotels became stages where I could perform a version of myself unconcerned with explanation, and I savored the anonymity as though it were a kind of freedom rather than a condition of erasure. Each stolen hour felt amplified by risk, made more valuable by the knowledge that it had been taken rather than given. I told myself that the pleasure I felt was earned through patience, as if enduring invisibility entitled me to intensity. The silences between us were not empty, but carefully calibrated, pauses designed to keep suspicion at bay while preserving anticipation. I convinced myself that this discipline was proof of maturity rather than a symptom of compromise. Living in parallel required constant vigilance, and I mistook that vigilance for devotion, because effort can feel like love when love is undefined. I learned how to speak without leaving traces, how to listen for what was omitted rather than what was said, and how to disappear without protest. The structure of this hidden life gave me purpose, because I was always anticipating the next encounter, the next message, the next affirmation that I still existed to him. I told myself that restraint refined desire, that what was delayed was therefore deeper, and that immediacy was overrated. In truth, I was learning how to compress myself into the margins of someone else's schedule. I accepted limitation as intimacy because it allowed me to keep believing. The pleasure was complicated by guilt, but guilt itself became part of the allure, adding a moral charge that made everything feel more vivid. I liked believing that I was daring, that I was choosing intensity over safety, even though safety had never truly been offered to me. The calculated silences felt like shared secrets rather than imposed boundaries, and I took pride in how well I could maintain them. I believed that discretion elevated me above recklessness, and that my ability to endure made me indispensable. I did not question why indispensability never translated into inclusion. I called the ache fulfillment because admitting emptiness would have unraveled everything. As the parallel life grew more elaborate, my original life began to feel like an interruption, something to be managed rather than inhabited. I measured time not by days, but by absences, and presence became something I borrowed rather than owned. The hotels blurred together, each room offering the same promise of intensity without consequence, and I accepted the sameness as proof of consistency. I ignored how easily I could be replaced within that sameness, because thinking about replaceability threatened the fantasy of uniqueness. I told myself that what we shared was insulated from ordinary decay, protected by its very secrecy. I did not yet see that insulation also prevents growth. Eventually, the guilt shifted from a stimulant to a weight, because sustaining a parallel life requires constant subtraction from the self. I noticed how often I edited my desires before expressing them, choosing what was permissible over what was honest. The calculated silences began to feel less like strategy and more like obedience, but I lacked the language to name that shift without indicting myself. I had invested too much identity in being capable of this arrangement to admit its cost. The pleasure that once felt transgressive started to feel procedural, and that realization frightened me more than exposure ever had. I was living two lives, but only one of them was allowed to be incomplete, and it was always mine. The first fractures did not announce themselves with drama, because they arrived quietly, disguised as inconveniences that were easy to excuse if I did not look at them for too long. A message would vanish from the thread, and I would tell myself it was caution rather than erasure, an act of protection rather than avoidance. Calls went unanswered with an irregularity that felt intentional, yet I accepted the delays as evidence of pressure rather than choice. His replies became carefully shaped, offering reassurance without information, and I learned to read tone instead of content as though that were a reasonable substitution. I told myself that ambiguity was inevitable in a situation like ours, and that expecting clarity would be naive. In doing so, I began to normalize absence as a form of presence. Each inconsistency forced me into a quiet negotiation with myself, because acknowledging the fracture would have required me to question the entire structure I had built around us. I convinced myself that deleted messages were signs of discipline, that unanswered calls proved he was managing risk rather than neglecting me. The fantasy adjusted itself to accommodate every irregularity, expanding just enough to keep my belief intact. I felt momentary discomfort, but I smoothed it over with rationalizations that preserved my sense of being chosen. I told myself that patience was a virtue and that love required tolerance for inconvenience. What I did not admit was how often I silenced my own instincts to maintain emotional equilibrium. The pattern became familiar before it became visible, because repetition dulls alarm when it is predictable. I started anticipating silence and preparing explanations in advance, which gave me the illusion of control even as my position weakened. I learned how to modulate my expectations so they would not collide with his availability, and I called that adjustment maturity. Every vague reply was treated as a placeholder for future clarity, a promise deferred rather than denied. I mistook his minimalism for restraint, believing that less said meant more felt. In reality, the gaps were not invitations to imagine, but warnings I refused to translate. Over time, the fractures stopped feeling exceptional and began to feel structural, as though instability were not a deviation, but the design itself. I noticed how quickly I recovered from disappointment, how efficiently I folded absence into routine, and that efficiency disturbed me more than the absence ever had. The fantasy survived not because it was strong, but because I was constantly repairing it. I became its primary caretaker, maintaining coherence where none was offered. I told myself that endurance was proof of commitment. I did not yet see that commitment without reciprocity is simply endurance. By the time I recognized how much effort it took to keep believing, belief itself had become an obligation rather than a choice. The fractures were no longer hidden, but I had learned how to step around them without slowing down. I felt a growing fatigue that I attributed to circumstance rather than imbalance. I continued to call it love because I had no alternative language that did not implicate me. It was easier to remain loyal to the fantasy than to confront what its fractures were quietly revealing. In that loyalty, I postponed the moment of reckoning. My justifications were subtle at first, small internal edits that softened reality just enough to make it livable without rewriting it entirely. I told myself that needing him was a natural response to intimacy, that longing was evidence of depth rather than imbalance. Each time I rearranged my schedule to accommodate his availability, I framed it as flexibility, a mark of emotional intelligence rather than self-erasure. I believed that adapting myself to him was a form of generosity, and generosity felt morally superior to demand. In this framing, dependence became devotion, and devotion felt noble. I did not question why nobility required so much silence. I learned to romanticize my own restraint, telling myself that my willingness to wait proved that what I felt was real. I called my anxiety sensitivity, my vigilance attentiveness, and my fear of lost passion, because those labels allowed me to remain proud of what was slowly consuming me. Whenever doubt surfaced, I accused myself of being impatient or insecure, as though emotional needs were character flaws. I told myself that love was supposed to hurt sometimes, and that discomfort was simply the price of depth. By reframing distress as meaning, I avoided the more frightening possibility that I was simply unavailable to myself. I confused endurance with intimacy because both require persistence. The language I used internally became increasingly compassionate toward him and increasingly demanding toward myself. I excused his distance as complexity while criticizing my own need for reassurance as weakness. I told myself that understanding him mattered more than being understood, because sacrifice sounded virtuous when mutuality felt unattainable. In this hierarchy, his limitations became circumstances and mine became failures. I believed that if I could just be more patient, more generous, more self-contained, the imbalance would resolve itself. I did not yet realize that balance cannot be achieved by leaning harder in one direction. As my dependence deepened, I mistook its intensity for proof of connection, because intensity is loud and can drown out quieter truths. I felt proud of how much I could hold without breaking, unaware that holding was slowly becoming my entire role. I stopped asking what I needed and started asking what would be easiest for him, calling that empathy rather than self-abandonment. I believed that love meant prioritizing the other, even when the other was never required to do the same. I did not notice how often my own voice appeared only as an afterthought. In calling dependence love, I made it feel intentional. Only later did I understand how thoroughly I had trained myself to accept less by celebrating my capacity to endure more. The justifications that once felt empowering eventually revealed themselves as coping mechanisms designed to preserve attachment at any cost. I had turned my adaptability into a virtue, so I would not have to confront my fear of being unnecessary. By calling dependence love, I protected the relationship from scrutiny while sacrificing my own agency. I told myself I was choosing this, because choice implies power. It took time to see how constrained that choice had become. With him, I felt articulate and expansive, as though my thoughts moved faster and landed with more certainty, because attention can create the illusion of coherence. I spoke freely, laughed easily, and inhabited my body without hesitation, believing that this version of myself was the most authentic. His presence acted like a mirror that reflected me back with just enough admiration to make me feel complete. I told myself that this ease was proof of compatibility rather than a response to intermittent validation. I felt seen not because he saw everything, but because he saw what I needed him to see. That distinction would only matter later. Alone, the edges of that self dissolved quickly, leaving behind a quieter, more uncertain version that I learned to manage rather than express. Silence expanded in his absence, and I filled it with analysis, replaying conversations for meaning I might have missed. I became cautious with my own expectations, negotiating with myself before allowing desire to surface. The confidence I felt with him did not follow me into solitude, and I told myself that this was normal, that no one is fully themselves alone. I did not question why being alone felt like a diminishment rather than a neutral state. I accepted the contrast as inevitable. The version of myself that existed with him was animated by anticipation, always oriented toward the next interaction, the next confirmation that I still mattered. Alone, I learned how to contain that anticipation so it would not expose how dependent I had become on external affirmation. I moderated my emotions, presenting calm where there was longing, composure where there was fear. I told myself that this self-regulation was maturity, a sign that I was emotionally sophisticated. In truth, it was a survival strategy, designed to make waiting feel manageable. I was performing stability for an audience of one. This split identity allowed me to maintain the relationship without confronting its cost, because I could attribute my loneliness to circumstance rather than structure. I told myself that everyone has different selves for different contexts, ignoring how stark the division had become. With him, I expanded. Without him, I compressed, and I accepted that compression as temporary. I believed that once circumstances changed, the two versions of myself would reconcile. I did not consider that the reconciliation might require loss rather than gain. The contrast persisted because it served the illusion. Over time, I realized that the self I was with him depended entirely on his availability, while the self I was alone had learned to exist without expectation. That realization unsettled me because it revealed how conditional my sense of self had become. I began to question which version was more real, the one fueled by proximity or the one forged in absence. I had built an identity around being wanted, and without that reinforcement, I felt strangely undefined. The contrast was no longer just emotional, but existential. It marked the point where desire began to feel like erosion rather than expansion. The return was not abrupt, but it was jarring in a way that no delay could soften, because reality does not need drama to assert itself, it only needs presence. As soon as we landed, the air between us changed, thick with things unsaid that the trip had carefully kept at bay. The rhythm we had created in transit collapsed under the weight of schedules, obligations, and the silent urgency of separation. I felt myself shrinking back into a role I had temporarily forgotten, one defined by limits rather than possibility. He moved seamlessly into this transition, while I struggled to understand how something that felt so complete could dissolve so efficiently. It was then that I realized how much effort it took to keep pretending that the return was merely logistical rather than symbolic. The illusion I carried from the trip began to feel fragile, like glass exposed to temperature change, and every familiar detail threatened to crack it. The way he checked his phone, the way his attention divided, the way urgency replaced intimacy, all reminded me that our closeness had conditions. I told myself that this discomfort was temporary, that reintegration always came with friction. Yet the friction did not lessen, it clarified, revealing how carefully the trip had protected me from knowing where I stood. I felt the distance grow not in miles, but in intention. What we had shared did not vanish, but it lost its authority. The return made visible what travel had helped me deny. I noticed how quickly he recalibrated his expectations of me, as though the rules had changed without discussion. The warmth remained, but it was rationed, and I accepted the rationing because I did not know how to ask for more without exposing myself. I began editing my reactions again, relearning how to be convenient. The fantasy had relied on suspension, and suspension had ended. I felt embarrassed by how much I had believed while we were away. The return forced me to confront the difference between intensity and integration. What unsettled me most was not disappointment but familiarity, because this was the version of him I already knew, and yet I had allowed myself to forget. The return did not introduce new information, it simply removed distraction. I could no longer pretend that our connection existed outside context. Context rushed back in, unapologetic and precise. I felt the weight of what I had been avoiding settle into clarity. The collision was not violent, but it was irreversible. By the time I acknowledged that the trip had been an exception rather than a preview, I had already lost the innocence of believing otherwise. I carried the return inside me like a quiet bruise, tender but undeniable. It marked the moment when hope began to feel like denial. I understood then that fantasy survives best in motion. Stillness exposes it. The discovery came without ceremony, delivered casually as if it were a neutral update rather than a revelation capable of destabilizing everything I thought I understood. His wife had sold the house, and the words settled slowly, expanding in meaning as I replayed them in my mind. A house is not just a structure, it is a record of decisions, compromises, and endurance, and the idea that it had been sold suggested an ending I had not been informed of. I felt an unexpected jolt of vertigo, because this was a decisive act that occurred entirely outside my awareness. The permanence of it unsettled me more than any lie ever had. Something substantial had shifted, and I had not been part of the conversation. I told myself that this could mean many things, and I cycled through each possibility with equal parts hope and restraint. Perhaps it was liberation, a step toward dissolution, a sign that everything was finally in motion. Or perhaps it was merely efficiency, a practical decision made within a system that continued to exclude me. The ambiguity felt cruel because it invited interpretation without offering clarity. I realized that even when change happened, I was not entitled to context. The house had been sold, but my position remained unchanged. That contrast disturbed me deeply. What struck me most was not the loss of the house itself, but the authority behind the decision. She acted while I waited. She closed a chapter while I speculated. I had imagined myself as central to his emotional life, yet here was evidence of a parallel reality where decisions were made without reference to me at all. The symbolism was unavoidable, because a sold house cannot be reclaimed by imagination. It represented commitment, finality, and agency, all things I lacked. I felt suddenly peripheral to a story I had believed I was influencing. I tried to interpret his reaction, searching his tone for reassurance or inclusion, but what I found was neutrality. He spoke of it as a fact rather than a turning point, and that calmness frightened me. I realized how little I knew about the internal negotiations of his life. The house was gone, and I had no claim to what replaced it. That realization settled like a quiet grief. In that moment, the fantasy I had nurtured encountered something concrete enough to resist reinterpretation. The house had been real, and now its absence was real too. I could not compete with that level of material consequence. I felt exposed in a way I had not before, because symbolism has a way of stripping illusions bare. The sold house became the first undeniable sign that things were moving without me, and I could not pretend not to see it. The exclusion did not feel deliberate, but it felt absolute, because it reminded me that proximity does not equal participation. This was not a small decision, not a logistical adjustment, but a restructuring of a life, and I had learned about it only after it was complete. I felt a sudden awareness of how limited my access truly was, despite how intimate our conversations often felt. I had known his thoughts, his doubts, his desires, yet not this. That contradiction made my intimacy feel ornamental rather than influential. I realized that I existed close to the center, but never within it. The more I considered the decision, the clearer my marginality became. He had navigated something significant without leaning on me, consulting me, or even warning me. I told myself that this was reasonable, that boundaries were necessary, but the explanation felt thin. If I mattered in the way I believed, I would have at least been informed before the fact. Instead, I received the news as an observer. The realization stung not because I wanted control, but because I wanted relevance. I had neither. I began to question how many other decisions had occurred beyond my awareness, quietly shaping a future I would never inhabit. The exclusion felt cumulative, as though this was merely the most visible example of a long-standing pattern. I had been invited into emotion, but not into consequence. That distinction reframed everything I thought I knew about our connection. I had access to his feelings, but not his life. The difference mattered more than I had admitted. I noticed how quickly he moved past the subject, as though its impact on me had not occurred to him. That indifference revealed how accustomed he was to compartmentalizing. I was one space among many, and my exclusion was not an exception, but a function of that structure. I felt foolish for expecting inclusion without invitation. The realization forced me to confront the limits of my role. I was close, but never close enough. What hurt most was understanding that my absence from the decision was not accidental. It was necessary. Including me would have complicated things, and I had always existed in the space reserved for simplicity. The exclusion clarified my function with painful precision. I was not part of the architecture of his life. I was a corridor, something passed through but not lived in. The fear arrived quietly, but once present, it rearranged everything, because it offered a narrative that explained too much to ignore. I began to see how neatly I fit into the margins of his life, how my presence absorbed pressure without demanding restructuring. I was not a destination, but a pause, a place where he could rest without committing to direction. That realization reframed every promise, every hesitation, every delay. I had mistaken proximity for trajectory. In truth, I had been standing still while believing we were moving forward. I replayed our history with new attention, noticing how often plans dissolved into possibility and possibility into silence. Nothing had ever been built with me in mind, only endured. I provided relief, not resolution. The idea that I was a detour rather than a plan explained his comfort and my anxiety with unsettling accuracy. I had been useful precisely because I asked for so little. That usefulness now felt like a trap. The fear was not just of loss, but of misinterpretation, of having invested meaning where there was none intended. I wondered how much of what I believed had been projection rather than promise. I had filled gaps with hope and called them direction. The realization left me disoriented because it suggested that my role had always been temporary, even when it felt consuming. I had built permanence from fragments. What frightened me most was recognizing how willingly I had accepted ambiguity because it allowed me to avoid confronting this truth. I had chosen interpretation over confirmation. The detour had felt like a path because I wanted it to be one. Now, stripped of illusion, it felt like wasted movement. I questioned my judgment, my desires, and my capacity to see clearly. The fear was not only about him, but about myself. In that moment, I understood how easily desire can become displacement, how passion can distract from direction. I had not been chosen to arrive anywhere, only to make waiting tolerable. The fear settled into something heavier than sadness, because it came with clarity. I was never meant to be part of the plan. I was meant to make the detour feel worthwhile. The anger did not erupt, because eruption would have required confrontation, and confrontation would have forced me to admit how much I had assumed without confirmation. Instead, it stayed contained, folding inward and settling behind my ribs like something too sharp to ignore, but too risky to release. I was angry at him for allowing my interpretations to stand in for truth, for benefiting from my belief without ever having to articulate commitment. At the same time, I was angry at myself for constructing an entire future out of implication and calling it faith. The absence of explicit promises became its own kind of betrayal, because silence can mislead as effectively as deception when it is convenient. I had believed in something he never technically offered, and that technicality haunted me. Every moment I revisited felt slightly altered by this realization, as though the emotional weight I had assigned to it now exceeded its original intent. I remembered how carefully he chose words that suggested movement without direction, closeness without claim, and how eagerly I had translated those suggestions into certainty. My anger sharpened as I saw the pattern, because ambiguity had always worked in his favor. He could not be accused of breaking promises he never made, while I carried the consequences of believing in them. That imbalance felt deliberate even if it was never consciously planned. I resented how easily he could retreat into literal truth while I was left with emotional debris. The containment of that anger became exhausting, because suppressing it required constant self-policing. I moderated my tone, softened my questions, and avoided language that might expose the depth of my disappointment. I told myself that restraint was dignity, but it felt increasingly like erasure. I did not want to be the woman who demanded clarity, because demanding would have revealed how vulnerable I was. So I swallowed the anger and called it understanding. In doing so, I protected him from discomfort and myself from exposure, but the anger did not disappear. What made the anger more corrosive was its lack of a clear target, because blaming him entirely felt dishonest and blaming myself felt unbearable. I existed in that uncomfortable middle, where responsibility blurred and resentment lingered without resolution. I wanted acknowledgement more than apology, a recognition that my belief had not been irrational but encouraged. The absence of that recognition made the anger feel solitary, something I had to carry alone. It was not loud, but it was constant, and constancy gave it power. Over time, I realized that the anger was not only about what had happened, but about what I had allowed. I had participated in my own misunderstanding because clarity threatened the fantasy I depended on. That realization did not dissolve the anger, but it redirected it inward with unsettling precision. I had believed without asking, hoped without verifying, and trusted silence because it was easier than truth. The anger remained, now tempered by shame. It marked the moment when belief stopped feeling innocent. I compared myself to her instinctively, even though I had no concrete information to justify the comparison, because imagination is fertile when fueled by insecurity. I filled in her outline with assumptions, attributing to her qualities that either diminished her or elevated me, depending on what my confidence required at the moment. Sometimes I imagined her as distant, exhausted, and inattentive, a figure worn down by routine, so that my presence could feel like renewal. Other times, I imagined her as composed and formidable, which allowed my longing to feel tragic rather than delusional. These shifting portraits were not about her at all, but about stabilizing my own position in the narrative. I needed her to exist in relation to me, even if that relation was entirely imagined. The comparison was silent but relentless, occurring in small, private moments when doubt crept in. I measured my emotional fluency against her presumed domestic competence, my intensity against her longevity, my attentiveness against her shared history. Each comparison was an attempt to justify why I mattered, why his desire for me was not incidental but necessary. I told myself that intimacy outweighed legality, that emotional connection was more authentic than institutional commitment. In doing so, I minimized what she had built while magnifying what I felt. The comparison allowed me to feel chosen without needing evidence. What unsettled me was how easily I could shift between admiration and contempt toward a woman I had never seen. I alternated between empathy and rivalry, depending on whether I needed moral distance or emotional justification. When guilt surfaced, I softened her image, telling myself she was already disengaged. When jealousy surfaced, I hardened it, imagining her as unfeeling or complacent. These mental adjustments helped me manage my discomfort, but they also revealed how little space I had left for complexity. She became a projection screen rather than a person. The comparison also functioned as a defense against my own invisibility. By positioning myself in opposition to her, I could claim relevance even in absence. I believed that as long as there was a contrast, I occupied a distinct role. Without that contrast, I risked becoming interchangeable. The imagined rivalry gave me definition in a situation that otherwise offered none. I did not question the ethics of this internal narrative, because questioning it would have exposed how fragile my sense of worth had become. Only later did I realize that the comparison was a way of avoiding the more painful truth, which was that neither of us existed as individuals in his life in the way I wanted to believe. She was part of structure, and I was part of escape, and comparison did nothing to change that division. By measuring myself against her, I had accepted a framework that excluded me by design. The comparison never empowered me, it only distracted me. And distraction was its true purpose. The understanding did not arrive as an epiphany, but as an accumulation, a slow alignment of experiences that finally formed a coherent pattern. I began to see that what I had interpreted as connection was often just shared avoidance, a mutual agreement to redirect discomfort rather than confront it. Betrayal had not united us in defiance of something unjust, but had merely shifted responsibility from him to me, from his marriage to our secrecy. The guilt did not disappear, it changed address. I was now the custodian of what he refused to process. That realization was sobering. I noticed how often our closeness intensified after moments of tension in his life, how my presence functioned as relief rather than choice. I had believed that being needed in this way made me special, but need born of avoidance is not intimacy, it is displacement. The bond one felt was reinforced by shared secrecy, not shared values or direction. We were aligned in what we were not facing, not in what we were building. Betrayal had created proximity, but not foundation. That distinction changed everything. The guilt I carried was not only about her, but about myself, because I had allowed my identity to be shaped by someone else's unresolved conflict. I had mistaken emotional labor for connection, believing that absorbing his turmoil brought us closer. In reality, it only relieved him while burdening me. Betrayal had not deepened our bond, it had made me complicit in maintaining his equilibrium. The intimacy I felt was asymmetrical, sustained by my willingness to hold what he would not. Seeing this dynamic clearly was painful. What disturbed me most was realizing how easily guilt can masquerade as intimacy, because shared secrecy feels like trust even when it is built on avoidance. I had believed that knowing his weaknesses gave me access to his truth. Instead, it had positioned me as a buffer. The bond one thought we shared was less about mutual recognition and more about emotional redistribution. He gave me what he could not place elsewhere, and I accepted it as love. That acceptance was my mistake. Once I understood this, the bond lost its mystique because it no longer felt like connection, but like maintenance. Betrayal had not brought us closer to honesty, it had merely postponed it. I saw how easily guilt travels, how it settles where it is most tolerated. I had tolerated it well. That tolerance had been misread as strength. It was, in fact, availability. The shame was quiet but pervasive because it forced me to confront how willingly I had transformed absence into meaning. I had told myself that being unseen made me special, that intimacy did not require acknowledgement, and that discretion was a form of power. In truth, I had been invisible because invisibility was convenient, and I had romanticized that convenience to preserve my dignity. I dressed my marginality in poetic language so I would not have to call it what it was. That realization stripped the narrative of its elegance. I had mistaken erasure for depth. I remembered how often I took pride in my ability to wait, to adapt, to require little, as though these were virtues rather than survival strategies. I told myself that needing less made me more evolved, more emotionally intelligent. Now I saw how those beliefs protected me from the pain of not being chosen openly. I had learned to find value in what was withheld because asking for more felt dangerous. The shame came from recognizing how thoroughly I had participated in my own disappearance. I had made myself smaller and called it grace. What hurt most was understanding that no one had asked me to romanticize my invisibility, because doing so benefited him, not me. I had offered my absence freely, framing it as autonomy rather than accommodation. I believed that my willingness to remain unclaimed proved confidence. In reality, it proved fear. The shame was not about loving him, but about how little I had demanded in return. I had negotiated against myself. As I looked back, I saw how often I softened moments that should have hurt, how often I reframed neglect as circumstance. I had trained myself to find beauty in waiting, so I would not have to confront rejection. That training was effective, but it was not benign. It allowed the situation to continue without change. I had mistaken endurance for empowerment. The shame was in that confusion. Only later did I understand that invisibility is not neutral. It shapes the self in quiet and lasting ways. I had internalized my own erasure, adjusting my expectations until they aligned with absence. Romanticizing invisibility had allowed me to survive the relationship, but it had also diminished me. That recognition did not free me immediately. It simply made the cost visible. The conflict lived inside me like a constant tension, because confrontation promised clarity but threatened annihilation. I wanted to ask the questions I had been avoiding, to force definitions where there had only been suggestion. At the same time, I feared that naming the truth would collapse the fragile structure that still held me upright. As long as things remained unspoken, possibility survived. Speaking risked ending not only the relationship, but the identity I had built around it. I was torn between wanting honesty and needing continuity. Each time I considered confronting him, I rehearsed both outcomes, imagining relief on one side and devastation on the other. I told myself that truth would set me free, but I was not convinced I could survive that freedom. The fantasy, however fragile, still provided structure, and structure can feel safer than uncertainty. I weighed the cost of knowing against the comfort of believing. Silence became the compromise I lived with. It allowed me to avoid both rejection and resolution. I noticed how often I delayed confrontation by waiting for the right moment, the right tone, the right emotional climate. Those moments never arrived because the conditions I required were designed to be unattainable. I told myself that timing mattered, but what I really feared was exposure. Confrontation would have revealed not only his intentions, but my expectations. I was not ready to see either clearly. The conflict persisted because both options threatened me. The terror of hearing the truth was not about what he might say, but about what I would no longer be able to deny. If he confirmed my worst fears, I would have to act. If he denied them convincingly, I would have to decide whether to believe him. Either outcome required agency, and agency frightened me. Waiting allowed me to postpone responsibility. The conflict kept me suspended between courage and avoidance. That suspension became my default state. In the end, the conflict itself became exhausting because indecision consumes as much energy as action without offering resolution. I lived in a constant state of preparation, emotionally braced for a conversation that never happened. I told myself that silence was temporary, that clarity would come when I was ready. In truth, readiness was not something I was moving toward. It was something I was avoiding. The realization that I had betrayed myself arrived with a different weight than everything that came before, because it did not allow for deflection or reinterpretation. I could no longer place responsibility solely on circumstance, secrecy, or his limitations without acknowledging my own participation. I had overridden my instincts repeatedly, negotiating against my needs in the name of patience and calling that compromise love. Each time I accepted less than I wanted, I told myself I was being reasonable, mature, understanding. In retrospect, those were not acts of generosity, but of self-abandonment. The betrayal was quiet, humiliative, and devastating precisely because it was voluntary. I had silenced questions that deserved answers and dismissed discomfort as insecurity, training myself to distrust my own perceptions. When something felt wrong, I explained it away before it could fully form, afraid that clarity would force me to act. I told myself that love required tolerance, never asking why tolerance always flowed in one direction. Over time, my inner voice grew cautious and restrained, more concerned with preserving connection than protecting truth. I became adept at minimizing my disappointment so it would fit inside the space he allowed me. That adaptation felt strategic at the time, but it was corrosive. What hurt most was recognizing how much effort I had invested in maintaining an arrangement that steadily diminished me. I had offered emotional labor without reciprocity, loyalty without security, and patience without horizon. I betrayed myself each time I chose silence over honesty, continuity over dignity. The awareness did not absolve him, but it complicated the narrative enough to strip me of innocence. I had been both participant and casualty. That duality was difficult to hold. I realized that self-betrayal is seductive because it often disguises itself as sacrifice, and sacrifice carries moral weight. I liked believing that my endurance made me noble, that my restraint elevated me above demand. In truth, it kept me contained. I had confused being accommodating with being strong. Seeing this clearly was painful, but it was also clarifying. Once I acknowledged my own role, the story shifted from something that happened to me into something I had helped sustain. That shift was unsettling because it returned agency to me at the very moment I felt most depleted. Betraying myself had felt easier than risking abandonment. Now I had to live with that choice. Awareness did not undo the damage, but it marked the beginning of accountability. The memories of the trip lingered longer than I expected, but their tone changed as distance grew, losing their softness and acquiring an edge. What once felt like refuge began to feel incriminating, as though each moment now testified against the narrative I had built around it. The laughter, the ease, the illusion of normalcy no longer comforted me because they existed only in contrast to everything that followed. I replayed those scenes not with longing, but with interrogation. I asked myself how I could have believed so completely in something so carefully insulated from reality. Details that once seemed tender began to feel calculated, as though the intimacy I cherished had depended on exclusion to survive. The trip no longer represented possibility, but suspension, a pause that delayed reckoning rather than invited transformation. I noticed how every pleasant memory was framed by the knowledge that it could not be repeated without the same conditions of escape. That limitation drained the joy from remembrance. The refuge had always been temporary, and now it accused me of forgetting that. I realized how much emotional weight I had placed on those days, using them as evidence that what we shared was real. Now that evidence felt compromised, because reality had resumed without integrating them. The trip had not changed anything except my expectations. I felt foolish for having treated it as proof rather than exception. Memory became less a comfort than a reminder of how willingly I had suspended judgment. The accusation was not cruel, but persistent, because it asked questions I could no longer avoid. Why did intensity feel so convincing? Why did I accept isolation as intimacy? Why did I believe that temporary closeness could override permanent structure? Each recollection pressed these questions forward. The refuge had transformed into a mirror. Eventually, I stopped revisiting the trip for solace, because it no longer offered any. It had become a symbol of what I wanted rather than what was possible. Remembering it hurt not because it was over, but because it had never truly begun. The accusation lay in that distinction. It reminded me how easily longing can distort memory. The house lingered in my mind long after the fact itself had settled, because it represented something tangible in a story built almost entirely from implication. It was solid, owned, exchanged, and finalized, everything my place in his life was not. I could imagine rooms, walls, accumulated years, all condensed into a decision that did not include me. The house had existed in the open, acknowledged and accounted for, and now it was gone, replaced by something equally real. My presence, by contrast, left no trace. I understood then that what unsettled me was not jealousy, but comparison between permanence and permission. The house had been part of a shared narrative recognized by others, while I existed only in fragments and intervals. I could not compete with something that had weight, history, and legal consequence. The metaphor was unavoidable because it clarified how little I had ever possessed. I had borrowed moments where others owned years. The sale symbolized closure, agency, and direction, all exercised without reference to me. I saw how my imagination had inflated my relevance, convincing me that emotional proximity equaled stake. The house reminded me that stakes are proven through action, not feeling. I had never been a consideration in decisions that mattered. That truth was difficult to absorb. What hurt was realizing that even endings belonged elsewhere. The dismantling of his marriage, however partial or incomplete, still unfolded without me. I had imagined myself as adjacent to change, when in reality I was separate from it. The house marked a transition I did not participate in. It stood as proof that real life continued beyond my reach. In that sense, the house was not just a metaphor for what I lost, but for what I never had. I had mistaken access for ownership. The sold house corrected that misunderstanding with brutal clarity. It grounded the story in facts where I had relied on feeling. This realization came slowly, not because it was subtle, but because accepting it required letting go of a comforting illusion. I had believed that our connection changed him, that it left a mark, that something of me would travel forward with him regardless of outcome. Over time, I saw how efficiently he adapted, how seamlessly he moved from one configuration to another without carrying visible cost. He adjusted, recalibrated, and continued. I remained where I was, altered and unsettled. I noticed how little of his life truly depended on resolution, because ambiguity worked in his favor. He was practiced in containment, skilled at preserving function despite fracture. While I processed, analyzed, and mourned, he reorganized. That asymmetry was impossible to ignore. I had mistaken emotional expression for vulnerability, not realizing how insulated he remained. The awareness stung because it exposed how unevenly consequence was distributed. I carried doubt, shame, and loss, while he carried continuity. Whatever discomfort he experienced was temporary and diffuse, never demanding transformation. I absorbed what he displaced. That pattern had existed all along. I realized then that I had served as a pressure valve, a place where complexity could be released without restructuring the system. That role protected him. It did not protect me. Understanding this reframed the entire relationship, stripping it of romance and revealing its function. The most painful part was accepting that this was not cruelty, but habit. He had always emerged intact. I had simply not wanted to see it. Letting go of that illusion marked the end of any remaining fantasy of impact. The grief that followed was strange, because it was not tied to a shared history, but to a private narrative I had nurtured alone. I mourned a future that had never been promised, a role I had never been offered, and a version of myself that only existed in anticipation. The loss felt real even though its object had been imaginary. That contradiction made the grief feel illegitimate, something I hesitated to name. I realized how much of my emotional investment had been directed toward what could have been rather than what was. I had lived in projection, sustaining myself on possibility. Letting go of that story felt like abandoning a part of myself because I had structured my hope around it. The mourning was quiet, unrecognized by anyone else. There were no rituals for this kind of loss. What made it harder was knowing that the story had felt coherent, even logical, while it existed in my mind. It had explained my patience, my sacrifices, my endurance. Without it, those choices felt exposed. Grief forced me to reinterpret my past without the comfort of narrative payoff. I grieved not only the imagined future, but the time and energy I had devoted to sustaining it. I grieved the certainty I thought I was building toward. I grieved the woman I believed I would become. That version of myself dissolved along with the story. In mourning what never existed, I learned how powerful imagination can be and how dangerous. The grief was necessary because it cleared space. But it was also humbling. It marked the end of illusion as refuge. Once the story collapsed, I was left with the task of rebuilding myself without its framework. For a long time, my identity had been organized around secrecy, anticipation, and adaptation. Without those reference points, I felt disoriented, unsure of how to define myself outside relation. I had to ask questions I had avoided for years, starting with who I was when no one was waiting for me. Reconstruction was not dramatic, but deliberate, requiring attention to small, neglected truths. I began noticing what I wanted rather than what was convenient. I practiced taking up space without apology, even when it felt unfamiliar. The process was uneven because self-definition after erasure is fragile. I was learning how to exist without contingency. I confronted how much of my self-worth had been outsourced, dependent on validation that arrived intermittently. Reclaiming that worth meant tolerating silence without interpreting it as absence. It meant choosing clarity over intensity. These shifts were subtle but transformative. Letting go of the mistress role required mourning the identity it provided because it had given me purpose, however compromised. Without it, I had to build meaning intentionally. That work was slower, but more honest. It demanded presence rather than projection. Over time, I began to recognize myself again, not as someone chosen in secret, but as someone capable of choosing openly. That recognition did not erase the past, but it repositioned it. I was no longer defined by what I accepted. I was learning to define myself by what I required. One of the hardest lessons was understanding how easily I had confused desire with influence. I believed that being wanted granted me leverage, that intensity translated into significance. In reality, desire is often fleeting and self-serving, responsive to need rather than commitment. I had mistaken attention for agency. That confusion had shaped many of my decisions. I saw how desire functioned comfortably alongside limitation, how it flourished without demanding consequence. It could exist entirely within constraint, benefiting the one who desired without empowering the one desired. This realization dismantled a belief I had held quietly but firmly. Wanting is not the same as choosing. Understanding this reframed my experience, stripping desire of its authority. It explained why intensity had not translated into action, why longing had not produced change. Desire had been real, but it had never been directional. It moved freely without obligation. The loss of that illusion was painful because it required me to stop romanticizing my impact. I had not been powerful. I had been available. That distinction mattered. It altered how I understood attraction, intimacy, and value. Learning that desire is not power freed me from measuring myself by someone else's appetite. It allowed me to reclaim agency where I had assigned fantasy. Power, I learned, requires choice, visibility, and risk. Desire alone offers none of these. Acceptance did not arrive as peace, but as clarity, because clarity does not soften truth, it simply stabilizes it. I understood that some stories carry their ending within their premise, and that knowing this does not prevent us from entering them. I had walked into something structurally unsustainable because it offered intensity where I felt emptiness. That choice did not make me foolish, but it did make me responsible. I stopped asking why it ended the way it did, because the answer was embedded in how it began. Secrecy, ambiguity, and imbalance are not neutral conditions. They shape outcomes predictably. I had ignored those signals because I wanted exception. Acceptance required relinquishing that desire. What changed was not the past, but my relationship to it. I no longer needed to defend my choices or condemn myself for them. I could acknowledge that I entered willingly, hoping for transformation, and that hope had limits. Understanding those limits was not defeat. It was maturation. I learned that entering a doomed story does not negate its emotional reality, but it does require accountability. I could honor what I felt without inflating what it was. That balance allowed me to integrate the experience rather than remain defined by it. In the end, acceptance was not about forgiveness, but about orientation. I faced forward without rewriting the past. Some stories are not meant to last. They are meant to reveal. And this one revealed me to myself.